I'd like to welcome everybody here for the second in our Arctic Speakers series of this year, whatever year it is, 2013. And I'm really pleased, actually, to 14. I'm trying really hard not to. I told you I'd say something stupid at the beginning. So I'm really pleased to welcome my old friend, my really old friend, Patty Wells, from the University of Western Ontario. Patty did her undergraduate and master's degree
and PhD
at Memorial University of Newfoundland. And I first met her, it's a really long time ago, in 1990 when she just come back from some work in New Zealand. But we won't talk about that today. And she's done some really interesting work looking at the Paleo-Eskimo prehistory of northwestern Newfoundland, and also some very interesting work with fishermen. And I have to read some of your distinguished on things that, we've been distinguished. So she won, she's a very recent PhD, and she's been on a postdoc fellowship at University of Western Ontario in the Department of Anthropology there. She won the Governor General's Gold Medal. I didn't know that. That's great. And she's also still a research associate at the Memorial University's Institute of Social and Economic Research, where she holds a SSHRC grant for archaeological work in northwestern Newfoundland at Port au Choix. So today, Patricia is going to talk to us about the modern and ancient seascapes of Newfoundland's inshore coastal region, and I'll just let you get to it.
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to come to Calgary for the first time and be one of the last Newfoundlanders. I guess most of the places had Newfoundland visitors for a long, long time, so I feel a little bit at home here. So as Marybeth said, I am an archaeologist, and most of the time I work in this part. This is the Great Northern Peninsula in Newfoundland, the Strait of Belle Isle, and I work on these two peninsulas that are part of the Port au Choix National Historic Site. It's a big Parks Canada site, and we have been working there for about 30 years. Actually, the project has been going on there, and my focus has been on Arctic small tool people, so the gross water and the middle phase of the Dorset in that area. And while we're working away at Phillips Garden, this lovely green meadowy site on the coast, just offshore, there's always fishermen working away on the inshore. This is a particularly ecologically rich area. A lot of nutrients are sort of up well just off the shore here, and this brings a lot of different species from small organisms right up to sea mammals, and they still all come here every year. And the people here and in many parts of Newfoundland fish on the inshore, and definitions of the inshore are not very distinct. Basically, the inshore is the water that's close to the shore, but generally it's the water or the area where fishermen will fish for the day and basically get home that night. And they use a couple of different kinds of boats. This is a small longliner off Phillips Garden in Port au Choix, and this is a trap skiff, or sometimes called a speedboat, although not the speedboats that you think of. But these trap skiffs are slightly bigger than some of the wooden boats because they would have been able to hold lots of traps for things like lobster fishing and that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of species that are still being exploited in the areas. Even in Port au Choix, for instance, you have shrimp, lobster, cod, halibut, herring, and mackerel, for instance. And there's often short seasons with quotas, but some professional fishermen are able to kind of hobble together a series of places for fishing and species for fishing as well. So this is Phillips Garden again. It's December. And all of the pre-contact cultures that lived in this region, they were also very much focused on the resources of the ocean. The terrestrial ecology, the animals, say the mammals in particular in Newfoundland are very few. Most of them are tiny. There's species of bats and things like that, but there are hardly any big mammals to exploit other than caribou for the most part. So every one of the pre-contact cultures exploited fish and sea mammals, and they were quite dependent on it. At Phillips Garden, for instance, the focus was on harp seals, and I'll talk about that again in a little while. In fact, the samples of harp faunal assemblages are up around 90% of each of the samples. So, but what I found really interesting is that for its entire human history over the millennia, the sea has been a really significant focus for all humans who occupied this place. And for the people who did that, they were spending a large part of their lives on the ocean, engaged with its biophysical nature, but also they would have been very much engaged in an emotional way, in a historical way. So people saw the ocean as a place which held lots of myths and memories. So for instance, if we're just standing and looking out over the ocean, standing next to a fisherman, we might be able to see some of the characteristics of what's going on. That fisherman may have more subtle sort of ecological information, but they're also seeing a much more socially complex place as well, where, for instance, there are conventions for how people and where people occupy different places on the surface of the ocean. And through this, they create a particular seascape. And this happens because every day, through the routine of their daily lives, they're performing all kinds of daily activities, but also in a social sense as well. So the people who came here, they all brought knowledge with them. They brought certain technologies and a way of doing things. But over time and through their experiences in this new place, they came to alter their practices, transform their technologies to meet the opportunities of the place. And so, for instance, a new identity emerged amongst people that was particular to the place. So this is going to be a talk that will concentrate, first of all, on Newfoundland inshore fishers and how they create their seascapes. And then I'm going to turn back to archaeology and hopefully be able to discuss some suggestions for how seascapes may have been constructed by the pre-contact Dorset. Okay, so Newfoundland was occupied pretty much by English and Irish settlers. So the English came from this part and the Irish came from this part. And they brought with them their traditional knowledge. They were often fishermen. But in Newfoundland, they would have been challenged by unique sorts of issues. And this would have entailed altering their practices. And through changes in those practices, you'll see that, in fact, a lot of how they saw themselves and their own personal histories was altered over time. And I should add that at around the 1950s in rural Newfoundland, not much had changed, in fact. This wasn't an economy that had a lot of cash, for instance, and people were seasonally mobile, and they would have engaged in gathering a lot of their own needs, their own resource needs, like wood, for instance. They would have grown a lot of their own food, and they would have traveled to different regions to fish, including as far away as Labrador from Newfoundland on a seasonal basis. One of the sources of cash in the early part was through the seal fishery. Traditionally, living in rural Newfoundland, you caught fish and you delivered it to a merchant who also owned a store, and he would have given you credit based on what he thought your fish was worth, and you could then use that credit to get manufactured goods. It wasn't a very fair situation. So opportunities to go and make money on the seal hunt was one possibility. So the seal hunt would have taken place well offshore at some of the fronts, but also people who lived in regions where the ice came quite close to shore, they would be able to walk off from their communities and walk out and kill seals. And of course, most of what they killed them for were pelts that they would have sold. But for a lot of the land-based people, they would have taken leather for themselves. These are modern photographs from Shoal Cove North on the Great Northern Peninsula, and people still make waterproof sealskin boots there. They soak them on these little frames. They put rocks on them to keep them just ever so slightly under the surface of the water. The hair rots off, then they stretch them and prepare them to make leather. And also, they'll consume certain amounts of seal as well. That's a seal flipper pie up there, which is, I have to say, sort of revolting, but my husband and my daughter love them. Anyway, so people would have moved in the winter, in many situations, would have moved into the interior, away from the coast in the winter. Fishing would have stopped, and going into the interior allowed you the opportunity to get wood that you would need for the rest of the year. And sometimes, and this is not very uncommon, people would have lived in tilts. So my sister-in-law lived in a tilt for the first few years until it was time for her to go to school, and by that time her mother had more children, and so only the dad and other males would have gone in and occupied the tilts. And so it was a lot easier also to stay away from the coastal storms and winds. So the interior was actually a comfortable place at that time of the year. And sometimes people moved their entire houses. So this is a photograph from 1968 in Trinity Bay in Newfoundland, where people would have floated their houses. So they boarded them up as best they could, but not actually with a great deal of effort. And they would have dragged them over the water to another location. And so the men in those boats, there's always a guy in the back, and he's holding an axe for the possibility of course, the house getting swamped, and they have to cut it before the boats are hauled underwater with the house. And this is a photograph also from the 60s in a place called Conch, where in the winter you could get the houses across the coves really easily on ice and using logs. So this illustration right here is from a place called Fogo Island up here. And the architect Robert Mellon has studied a lot about the vernacular architecture in this region, and he did a map of the house relocations that he was told about in his own research. So people would have moved their houses on a semi-permanent basis. This didn't happen every season or anything, but and once electricity came, which would have been not until the 50s or 60s in a lot of these places, that kind of tied all the houses to the ground. Although Mary Walsh tried to float a house in Trinity Bay and it sank in recent years. All right, so for the English and the Irish who came here, beginning around 500 years ago, the focus was very much on the cod fishery. And the technology that they used for catching the cod hadn't actually, and has not actually changed very much over the years on the inshore region. In 1992, most of you will know that there was a moratorium that ended the cod fishery for the most part. And for many of those fishermen, they sold their licenses back to the government. They had opportunities to retrain in other areas. They retired, or they moved into the industry on the offshore, so they would have worked for large factory freezer trawlers hundreds of miles offshore. But there are still some professional fishermen in Newfoundland, as you saw from the boats in Port au Choix, who manage to get small quotas of cod and then catch other things as well. Codfish are, ecologically, they tend to stay in water in the summer. They're usually down around 20 meters below the surface. They like to stay just above the surface of the water, and they will congregate around rocks, and then as the current goes past, they can sort of stay in the lee. And in the winter, they will move offshore, but they like to stay in relatively deep water. They like it to be relatively cool, and that's where they're found. So I'm just going to show you, we're in Trinity Bay right here, and this is a community called Winterton. Here's the land right here. And the codfish tend to congregate on shoals. Shoals are just shallow water plateaus, shallow plateaus under the water. So they're like hills. And on these hills, there are other various features. And And I interviewed a lot of the people who fished in this area over the years and talked to them about how they occupied the space, how they caught the fish, how they got out there to begin with. And one of the things that unfortunately these charts don't show are the subtleties of that topography. It would be really interesting to do some work where we can get much more detailed topography. So families possess the knowledge of how to relocate these very specific places under the water. So I'll remind you, you can't see them. They're too deep. And so they basically locate them by triangulating. So they'll use landmarks such as this house. These are all photographs from around Winterton. So here's Winterton right here. This house is out at the end of this part of the harbor. And basically what they'll do is they'll keep a landmark at the stern of the boat. They'll head out. When they cross a second point, they will know that they're over a particular piece of land. And you learn that knowledge from your family, and you will fish in that shoal, and you won't fish in other shoals. Sometimes the shoals all have names, or the grounds will have a name. So in Winterton there's an offer ground. So we're in a boat on the offer ground right now in this photograph right here. And the fishermen know specific features on those grounds. So rocks, for instance. And one of the fishermen told me that the rock that we were fishing around was called Billy's Rock. And I said, who's Billy? And he said, well, I'm not exactly sure, but I know I'm related to him. And I just thought it was really amazing that a person had never seen a rock, but knew how to find it and felt like he was related to it in a sense. So there's a really interesting language around it as well. So as we head out the harbor and you get out so far, you can look inside the next cove and you might see a feature inside that cove, and you use the term that you'll open up. So you'll open up Harris's house. So in other words, Harris's house becomes visible as you head out, and you've got to make sure that you've opened it up or you're not over the grounds. And that's kind of how it works. And this unusual, like, jutting rock, it's got the name Nicky's Ear, and nobody claimed to be related to Nicky in that one. So this is a fisherman on the other side of Trinity Bay. This is in New Bonaventure, and this guy's name is Bruce Miller, and he is doing a little bit of fishing off Wolf Head. He said, I'm on the Wolf Head grounds, and I said, okay, and he said, there's Wolf Head right there. And I didn't know what he was talking about. This is a close-up of Wolf Head, and of course, I took pictures of it because I thought at some point I got to sit down and look for the nose and the ears and the teeth and all the parts, why this is called Wolf Head. No one's got the last name Wolf here because some places are named after last names, but I couldn't see any wolves right here. And what's interesting about it is when we moved around to the south and I saw it in profile, I realized, oh, it's not a wolf, it's a wolf fish. And so it just makes you realize that you have certain assumptions based on your own knowledge and your experiences of place, and your own assumptions about things that makes you realize that you think you know a lot about the ocean, but if you're not spending a whole lot of time out there, you sure don't. So this is just a sequence of photographs right here. Bruce is lining up, this is called Wester Head, and then he's looking back because this is Wolf Head. I'm sorry, I couldn't get it any closer, but he has to close Wolf Head. So he has to bring his boat inside so that he can no longer see Wolf Head in order to get himself over those grounds. So as I mentioned earlier, the technology for catching fish hasn't changed very much. And these are called long lines, and it's not a great, I have to figure out a way to draw it myself. But basically what happens is you have a series of floats, and in the old days when you were just going out in your small speedboat, you'd have a float with an anchor and a float with an anchor, and in between you'd have one line with hooks that you've baited. And this is a bucket of baited hooks. And you would suspend those baited hooks just above the surface of the ocean to attract the codfish. You'd do it over a shoal that you'd located, and then you'd go back at the end of the day and check and pull up your nets. So this was a job that required just one person. Sometimes you'd have a partner with you, and you could rebait and then put your lines out again. But basically, this is something that this long lining, or trawl lining, some people called it, was something that could be accomplished with a single person going out for the day, or they would go out in the morning and return later. And then around the mid-19th century, a new technology emerged. The cod trap, and this is what it looks like right here. And basically, the technology changed quite a bit. You have this, there's a bottom in this big net. You have floats again and anchors. Sometimes they're anchored to the shore, or sometimes just anchored to a shoal. And this is a leader line, and you would set it up so that the current runs a certain way, and fish will go in, and they'll just congregate in there. So the fish don't get damaged. You can leave that out for a while before you need to check it. This is a simple drawing. Sometimes they're angled so the fish don't just have a harder and harder time to get out. So sometimes they're anchored to the shore. So now you are looking for grounds and shoals that are quite close to shore. And suddenly you have different characteristics that you're looking for. For instance, you want a flat bottom for these nets. The other thing that's happening is that you need more people. It's hard for a single person to load the boat. So in this picture from the early 1900s, there are a number of men engaged. And again, right here, this is another picture from Newfoundland of them emptying cod traps. So now you have a different sort of social organization around a task. So the technology, the ecology of the fish hasn't changed, but the technology has changed. And the technology has introduced a new sort of social organization around the exploitation of the fish. Okay. So now you have a situation where there is a competition for particular locations. Traditionally, what would happen is that people would tear out in the spring and claim a place. Claim a berth is what they would call the place, because these nets are set up for the season in that place. And they're just lifted, and then they're allowed to float back down again. So competition for that was pretty steep. And in a lot of communities, that just meant that you got out there early, and you had the rights to those shoals. So the shoals themselves were also very contentious, and you'll notice that I have Winterton Harbour is right here, and I have just got these shoals right here. I don't have any information, because I was talking to fishermen that always fished up that end, and there's no way that they would ever go down that way. It's just, it would be socially, their family doesn't belong down that way, they should never fish there. And interestingly, I remember hearing a story about a man who had died in a house fire, and there was a fisherman, an old crotchety fisherman in the community, who said, well, that's what happens when you've fished up that other end. You have no right to fish on those. He thought the guy had it coming to him, because he put his lines out in a place where socially it was wrong. And then Bruce told me that there were very ambitious, very aggressive fishermen who would get out. They would keep their nets out long. And he said they weren't called cod fishermen, they were called cod killers. They had a reputation of being a little bit aggressive. And what was interesting is, I think that sometimes you hear people talking about resettlement that came in the 60s with the Joey Smallwood, which was an understandable social reorganization, but actually the impact on people was really significant, because suddenly you had people entering communities and feeling like they had no right to anything in that community. And organization around berths changed. They became a lottery, and there were really prime berths and then secondary berths. And so lotteries went in, and people had to somehow move into that community, and it was very, very hard on them. And a lot of people go back to the old resettled communities and they spend the summer there. So here's a really modern house that's been built in a place called Curlews Harbour, which was resettled in the 60s. And this is British Harbour. And so fishermen still fish out of here in the summer, but they've built themselves cabins. They all moved into places like New Bonaventure and Old Bonaventure. And you'll see these meadows on the way out. So now, instead of using the houses as their marks, they're using the gardens that are all that's left behind. One of the things that also happens, I should mention, is that there's a recreational fishery in Newfoundland. So the impact of losing access to codfish was recognized by the provincial government as being very dramatic for people. And so twice a year, anybody who wants to can go out and catch 5 fish a day for about 1 week in August and another week in September. And everybody loads their grandchildren and their grandmother, and everybody gets put on the boat and taken out, and they'll catch their 5 fish a day. And it's interesting because when I was ambivalent about this thing, this fishery, because I thought there are professional fishermen trying to make a living at this. They resent it. But when I was asking people about the marks, they said, you know, one fisherman told me that he took his granddaughter out and she said, "What is that rock? Does that have a name?" And it was Nikki's ear, because she just thought, well, that's a strange looking rock. And he said, if she hadn't come out, she wouldn't know the name of that. And he felt like it was a terrible loss. That basically, that this was an important kind of heritage for those people. And they were very, very happy to share that kind of information with me. They're quite delighted that I'd even talk in public about things like that. So their seascape is obviously built around ideas of the ecology of the resource that they're after, the technology that they're using, and then also their social relationships that they have. The names of the marks, the grounds, they're all based on their own background. So sometimes the church steeple is often used. There's Christian names for things. There's Angel's Head and those kinds of names. Also there's physical names like shapes of things such as the wolf head. And then there's names for marks and grounds that have a real sort of sense of kinship for those people. And so as a result of this, these Newfoundland fishermen, while they still understand themselves as being of English and Irish descent, also know that they're actually now Newfoundlanders, that that's behind them and that they have this new kind of identity. So now I'm going to shift back to Philip's Garden and back to the Dorset, whose seascapes are obviously incredibly intangible. Because of course there's no one to interview, and there aren't even people who they're related to today who I could interview. And this is Philip's Garden, where the harp seals, the harp seals pass by here on their southward migration in the winter. The water is open during that time of the year. They're traveling south out of the Arctic, getting ahead of the Arctic ice and heading into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And they spend the winter there, they breed and have their pups and molt, and then they head back up and they pass by Philip's Garden again for a brief period. The migration is brief here. It's abundant and it's predictable, but it's only for a few days to a few weeks. And so again, the water would have been open. Although there was ice around in the spring, this had a tendency to channel the seals into these kind of rivers. But people were basically hunting the seals in open water. And they were using a harpoon technology. So they had these end blades, these harpoon heads, and foreshafts. And these would have been connected to a shaft. And they would have been hunting them on open water. And seals are actually pretty big. A harp seal is 450 pounds or whatever. So there's a possibility that more than one person was catching them. Because these things didn't often kill a seal. You would catch it, and then you had to deal with this big, struggling animal in the water. And we think that the Dorset probably hunted them cooperatively here at Philip's Garden, because The houses are really big. They would have accommodated many more people than in the average family. So we sort of think that there was abundance, there was predictability, but it was brief. And so the people at the site would have geared up and hunted collectively. So seals are important throughout the Arctic. There were a lot more species that are collected by the Dorset throughout the Eastern Arctic and into Greenland. And they are represented in particular carvings, and this would be a slightly typical example. There are not many carvings of seals in the Arctic. But one of the things that you'll notice about them is that there are real distinct features. First of all, they come as three-dimensional carvings. You can usually see features such as nostrils, eyes, little ear holes at times, and flippers with distinct digits in the hind and the front. And the people who hunted seals in these areas, of course, they were often decorated as well. But the people who were hunting seals in the Arctic were hunting them through the ice, on the land, and also in open water. But in Philip's Garden, there are lots of characteristics that are reminiscent of those carvings from the Arctic, but there are actually quite a lot of significant differences. And what you'll notice is that you can see the features such as the head, the flippers, but there are not many that have examples with eyes, with nostrils, and with distinct digits. They're also all flat. You'll see this one right here is this guy right here. And some of them, it's as though the features are sort of amorphous, or they're smoothed out. And occasionally you'll have much more abstract forms. But you can see that if you pick that up, you might not know what it is, but you can see the overlap with the tiny head and flippers. Here are some more examples from the Portachois Museum. Again, sort of more and more abstract, some of them. This one's really abstract, and it comes from the rooms. And so I think that basically what's going on is that these things may be representing important moments and important representations of places where the Dorset would have spent their lives, that they could represent some aspect of their seascape. So again, if you think about these Dorset seal hunters who would have spent a lot of time on the water in this area, there were a lot of important events taking place here. And this is a harp seal swimming off Newfoundland, or off Portachois actually. And so there would have been moments when you would actually have killed these animals, and that time would have been when you were over the animal, when you were looking down, when the water was obscuring many of the animal's features. This was a moment when things were probably going to be fairly dangerous, and possibly a kind of an important engagement between the animal and the hunter. And I think that the lack of sort of three dimensions is a representation of those particular events. And so I think that, like the cod fishers, who spent a lot of time living, socializing, and working on the ocean, the Dorset would have had a similar sort of relationship in terms of the way that they were spending time. So a relationship between the technology, the ecology of the resource itself, and the kinds of life experiences that took place on the water. I think that the Dorset almost certainly would have had a really rich and complex social construct for the seascape, and these could possibly have influenced the form of some of the material culture, that it may have expressed some of those some of the construct. And of course, I think that carvings probably express many things, but I think it's probably not unreasonable to suggest that these carvings could have something to do with the seascape. So thank you. Right, and I just want to go back This is a carving. This is actually an iron statue that's in just off Phillips Garden. It was designed by an Inuit fellow named Michael Massey, and the ironwork was done by another artist whose name was Jim Maunder, and that he also designed this kayak, which is down on the beach in front of Phillips Garden. I think that they're really beautiful. All right, does anyone have any questions or comments? Yeah. Not so much like skeleton motifs. The most common motif is just parallel lines. But you'll see that in some cases, you might not be able to see a little zigzag here. Sometimes here are parallel lines. Sometimes there's a couple more down near the base, which would suggest flippers. But nothing similar to that central line with other lines projecting out. Not one. Yeah.
This is just a comment. You mentioned that the fishermen locating their place, looking at the landscape. I'm from Japan, and Japanese fishermen exactly do the same thing. And they set their nets so that they need to locate their place precisely.
Mm-hmm.
So that they look at the mountains to direction. Then actually, today's researcher did research on that ability, fisherman's ability, and their location ability is very precise.
Yes, and you know, it's interesting to think that there's a lot of, I don't know if you've ever heard that the weather is bad in Newfoundland. It's not true. No. Basically, there can be a lot of fog, and so sometimes these marks are not easy to locate. And when you're out there and the fog also comes up, you are nonetheless aware of and understanding currents and the what is that? What is the swells? And so you can normally, those fishermen know a lot about the subtleties of where they are at any time as well. And it was incredible when I was going out, because I went out with one time with this guy who had a fish finder, and it still took us forever. And the next day we just went out with this man, and he just like effortlessly, he said, "I think we'll stop here." And the guy said, "Really? You don't think we're out, we're not out very far?" He said, "No, it's okay, we're right here." And it was like when you put the hand line down, because when you're catching cod for the recreational fishery, you can just put a hook down that's the shape of a fish and you'll catch cod, and you just put it over the side and you lower it, and when you're lowering and the line is running out, but actually the line ran out in no time, and so we'd hit bottom very quickly. So they are recording the markings visually, but they are recording the markings in a much more broad sensory level as well. Yeah. Yes?
I wonder if the idea of a seascape, you could test it in other subarctic environments, let's say in Western Europe, the Magdalenian, Western France and Northern Spain has quite a rich bone industry. But what I remember from that industry has nothing like this. The harpoon industry is beautiful, sophisticated, but nothing that is as ambiguous as what you have on that photograph.
Yeah.
Even though I see the parallel between that and the seal there.
Yes.
So I wonder, would it be useful to find the parallels of a seascape in societies that also live near under Arctic conditions like that?
Yes, well, of course, because I don't think that you can spend any time anywhere without creating a kind of a seascape. And it's also, you just don't know exactly how it can show up materially. So for instance, I did wonder, so what if we were looking at traditional Newfoundlanders, how would we ever know anything about their seascapes based on the material culture that they left behind? Well, again, we would be right back to having the hooks and the codfish bones, but we would have a really hard time understanding the other subtleties, the intangibles of their seascapes. And I'm not sure if we would be able to. But there's no question that they exist. It's just, it's really hard. The Arctic is really interesting because you have a seascape and then you have an icescape, and things are changing all the time. But people use the marks also for locating places on land, of course, and again use that triangulation. It's just, I think that the sea introduces lots of interesting complexities. We don't really belong on the sea. We are mostly just on the surface of the sea, and we have reason to be very wary of our place on the ocean because it's so potentially dangerous. So it introduces really interesting possibilities. And I suppose the idea is to say that these Newfoundland seascapes are so complex, so socially complex, that we have to be very in tuned to the possibilities from our archaeological stuff. Yes?
I have the impression that a lot of young Inuit have really embraced GPS technology in their hunting, sometimes to their peril. Is that the same situation in Newfoundland with younger fisher people?
Yes, for sure. And because you'd be, in a way, you'd be a fool not to have it. But the problem is that if you lose it at any point, then you're in trouble. And I do know people who hunt, who are partridge hunters, for instance, on the barrens in Newfoundland. And the barrens are notoriously foggy and it's so incredibly easy to be lost in. And the people I know will take an old-fashioned compass as well as an electronic GPS. Yeah, so, yeah, but I think that I think that the people who were able to tell me about these grounds and shoals and the marks for getting to them, they really value them. And that's why I think they're so forthcoming in telling me about them. I was talking to a Scandinavian archaeologist who was working in the Faroes, and he couldn't believe that fishermen would tell me the marks because there's such a carefully guarded secret in that area. He couldn't even find out who owned the land up the road, let alone how do they get to their fishing grounds. But I think it's because they want it to be out there. Yeah?
So what's the next step? Where are you going with this in the future?
Well, I think one of the things that it's an industry that is dying. There's probably one more generation. And this generation, even the present day professional fishermen are using fish finders or sonar to locate fishing schools. So the knowledge is disappearing, and I think it has an enormous value, and it needs to be recorded just in and of itself. What I would like is to team up with somebody who can give me much more fine-grained information about the topography under the water, because it's incredible what detail the fishermen know, and it's completely invisible. And they will tell you that there is a pool there, that there's a rock in a hole. They'll say there's a hole there, and there's a big rock in the hole. They've never seen it, but they know it's there. And I'd love to be able to get, you know, a geography or someone to look for that.
So there's no seafloor mapping for fifth grade or anything like that?
Not-
I mean, I know there's the sea level work, but not like the seafloor mapping that's been done. The resolution's getting pretty good. It's totally feasible.
Totally feasible, yeah.
Yeah.
But it isn't done, especially not for the inshore.
Yeah, interesting.
What about just getting an ROV then?
Yes, that would be great. I don't have any money for that yet. Yes?
How did the Dorset people fish?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that because we don't have any fish hooks. We don't have fish hooks. We have nothing that looks like a net weight. And I asked a fisherman, what would you do? I ask fishermen lots and lots of questions about my Dorset technology. So the best answer I had so far was, in the summer, there's a small fish that beaches itself, and it's laying eggs. It's called capelin, and the capelin will run, and they'll run in, and the codfish normally staying near the bottom will come close to the surface, just going up and through the capelin, feeding on them. And he said, and I said, what would you do if all you, if you had no nets? And he said, well, when the capelin run, you could tie a pitchfork to a piece of rope and fire it out into the capelin, and if you pulled it back, it would have cod on the end of it. And I thought, well, I have barbed points. Maybe that's how they were caught. And I have big vertebrae too. Even in the gross water site, which is a much more ephemeral occupation. Steve Kumba looked at some of my codfish vertebrae, and he said this particular individual was probably close to 2 meters long. So this is a big codfish, and there could have been nets, though. I haven't given up on the idea of nets, but it's unlike the Dorset not to have a beautiful net sinker. To just use a rock is not a Dorset thing, But there are these unusual tools that I have that look like they could be needles for knitting nets.
But I thought jigging for cod in the old days was extremely easy.
Jigging for cod is still easy. And yes, but you still have to have a hook. And and I've looked really carefully and thought about the possibilities of composite pieces, but there's nothing that looks like a hook. Yeah, and yes?
Any of the little seal carvings, they all seem to have quite a shiny, one end of them quite shiny and smooth. Do you think they're for shaping skins or boots or something?
I don't think so. They're really delicate, and they're really often just 2 centimeters long. Some of them have a little bit of shellac on them, because Elmer Harp excavated some of them in the 50s and 60s. The shellac is not hurting them, but it's not coming off either. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Thank you.